The gunshot echoed across the Montana wilderness as Kieran Blackwood missed his target, the wild turkey disappearing into the underbrush with a flutter of indignant feathers. He cursed under his breath, holstering his Colt revolver with a practiced motion that had become second nature in his 32 years of life. The year was 1878, and spring had finally broken winter's hold on the land, bringing with it the sweet scent of wildflowers and new beginnings, though Kieran had long since stopped believing in those for himself. He adjusted his worn leather hat, its brim permanently creased from years of faithful service, and ran a hand through his dark beard, which had grown too long during the lonely winter months. His horse, a loyal chestnut mare named Penny, nickered softly beside him, seemingly mocking his poor aim. "Don't you start," Kieran muttered, patting her neck. "Been a while since I needed to hunt anything smaller than a deer." The truth was, Kieran's skills were as sharp as ever. It was his heart that wasn't in it today. 3 years of solitude in this wild country had worn on him in ways he hadn't anticipated when he'd first fled west from Boston, leaving behind the memories of a family lost to influenza and a banking career he'd grown to despise. He led Penny toward the sound of running water, both of them parched from the afternoon sun. The river that cut through this part of the territory was his lifeline, providing fresh water and occasional fish when his supplies ran low. His cabin, built with his own hands, stood a mile upstream, not that anyone knew its location. Kieran preferred it that way. As they approached the bend in the river, something unusual caught his ear, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. A voice. A woman's voice, clear and sweet, rising and falling in song. For a moment, he thought he might be imagining it. It had been so long since he'd heard singing of any kind that wasn't his own off-key humming or the occasional drunken miner passing through. Kieran tethered Penny to a young aspen and moved silently through the trees, his footsteps masked by years of practice. When he reached the river's edge, he froze. There, perched on a smooth boulder with her skirts carefully arranged around her, sat a woman unlike any he'd seen in these parts. Her copper-colored hair was pinned loosely at her nape, with wayward strands dancing in the breeze. Her simple blue dress spoke of practicality rather than wealth, but she wore it with a natural grace that caught his breath. And that voice, it flowed as pure as the river itself, an old Irish ballad about love lost and found again. Kieran stood transfixed, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible vision. The song spoke of longing and return, of paths crossing when least expected, and something in his chest, something he thought had died years ago, stirred to life. As the last notes faded into the rush of the river, he knew with absolute certainty that this woman was an answer to a question he hadn't even known how to ask. Then he stepped on a dry branch, and the crack might as well have been another gunshot. She whirled around, green eyes wide with alarm, her hand flying to her throat. In an instant, the spell was broken. "Who's there?" Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Show yourself." Kieran stepped out from the tree line, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Didn't mean to frighten you, madam." Her eyes narrowed, taking his measure, the worn clothing, the revolver at his hip, the weathered face that had seen too much sun and too little kindness. "Are you in the habit of spying on folks, mister?" she asked, standing up on her boulder, clearly calculating whether she could outrun him if needed. "No, madam, I was heading to water my horse when I heard singing." He gestured back toward where Penny waited. "Don't get much music out here." She relaxed slightly but remained wary. "Well, now you've had your concert, free of charge." "It was worth more than I could pay anyway," he said honestly, surprising himself with the words. A hint of color touched her cheeks, and she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm Violet Moore. My father and I are setting up our claim about 2 miles downstream." "Kieran Blackwood," he replied, tipping his hat. "Been up this way a while now." "The station master mentioned there might be a hermit in these parts," she said, a hint of challenge in her voice. "I'm guessing that would be you." Despite himself, Kieran felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "Hermit's a bit harsh. I prefer selective socializer." That earned him a small smile, revealing a dimple in her right cheek. "Well, Mr. Selective Socializer, I should be getting back before my father sends out a search party." She gathered her shawl, which had been lying on the rock beside her, and stepped carefully to the riverbank. Without thinking, Kieran moved forward and offered his hand to help her down from the slippery rocks. She hesitated for just a moment before placing her fingers in his calloused palm. The touch was brief but electric, sending an unfamiliar jolt through his arm and straight to his chest. From her quick intake of breath, he wondered if she'd felt it too. "Thank you," she said, withdrawing her hand once safely on the grassy bank. "My pleasure, Miss Moore." He stepped back, giving her space. Do you come to the river often?" She studied him, as if trying to decide whether his interest was threatening or something else entirely. "Sometimes," she finally said. "My father's land doesn't have a natural water source, so we make the trip daily." Kieran nodded, uncertain what to say next. 3 years of minimal human contact had eroded his social graces. "Perhaps we'll cross paths again, Mr. Blackwood," she said, gathering her skirts to navigate through the tall grass. "I'd like that," he replied, too quickly to hide his eagerness. She paused, looking back at him with curiosity. "Why did you come out here, Mr. Blackwood? To live alone, I mean?" The question caught him off guard. Most folks in these parts respected the unspoken rule you didn't ask about a man's past unless he offered it up first. "Needed the quiet," he said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. She nodded as if she understood completely, which surprised him. "There's healing in silence," she said softly. "But sometimes there's healing in song too." With that enigmatic statement, she turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Kieran standing by the river, feeling more alive than he had in years. For 7 days, Kieran found himself drawn back to the river bend, always at the same time. Twice more he heard her singing, once a folk song he didn't recognize, and once a hymn his mother used to sing on Sundays. Both times, he revealed himself rather than hiding like some lovesick boy, and both times they talked a little longer than before. He learned that Violet was 24, that she and her father had come from Illinois after her mother passed away, and that they hoped to establish a small farm. She had a quick wit and didn't seem put off by his gruff manner, which had grown rougher with isolation. On the 8th day, when she didn't appear, he felt a hollowness that alarmed him with its intensity. On the 9th day, he saddled Penny and rode downstream, telling himself he was just checking his trap lines. The Moore homestead was easy to spot: a half-built cabin with fresh-cut timber, a canvas tent pitched nearby, and the beginnings of a cleared field. A thin spiral of smoke rose from a cooking fire, and as Kieran approached, he saw Henry Moore, a barrel-chested man with graying red hair, struggling to hoist a heavy beam. Kieran hesitated only briefly before dismounting. "Need a hand with that, sir." The older man turned, startled, then squinted against the sun. "Wouldn't turn it down, stranger." For the next 2 hours, Kieran worked alongside Henry, helping raise the cabin walls higher. They spoke little, communicating mostly through nods and gestures, the rhythm of the work familiar to both men. Kieran found comfort in the honest labor, in using his body for something constructive rather than merely survival. When Violet returned from gathering berries, her basket full and her cheeks flushed from the sun, she stopped dead at the sight of Kieran helping her father. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Just lending a hand," he replied, suddenly self-conscious of his sweat-soaked shirt and dirty hands. Henry looked between them with raised eyebrows. "You two acquainted? We've met by the river a few times," Violet explained, setting down her basket. "Mr. Blackwood has been kind enough to keep me company while I collect water." "Has he now?" Henry's tone was neutral, but his eyes were assessing as they rested on Kieran. "Your daughter sings beautifully," Kieran said, feeling the need to explain himself. "Reminded me there's still some beauty in this world." Something in his words must have resonated with Henry, for the man's expression softened slightly. "That she does, got her mother's voice." He clapped Kieran on the shoulder. "Stay for supper. Least I can do after your help today." Kieran's first instinct was to refuse to retreat back to his solitude, but one look at Violet's hopeful expression changed his mind. "Thank you, sir. I'd be honored." That evening marked the beginning of a change in Kieran's life. The simple meal of rabbit stew and johnny cakes around the moor's fire was the first time he'd shared food with others in years. Conversation came haltingly at first, but by the time the stars emerged, he found himself telling stories of his early days in the territory, of the bear that had nearly taken his life 2 winters ago, and of the spectacular northern lights he'd witnessed from his cabin porch. Henry, it turned out, had been a blacksmith back east before deciding to try his hand at farming. His wife's death had left him restless, unable to stay in the town where every corner held memories. "Sometimes a man needs new horizons," he said, stoking the fire. "New land, new purpose." Kieran nodded, understanding all too well. Violet spoke of her dreams for the homestead fruit trees, a vegetable garden, maybe even bees for honey someday. Her eyes lit up when she talked about the future, something Kieran had stopped doing long ago. As the evening grew late, Kieran knew he should return to his cabin. The night would be dark, but Penny knew the way, and he'd made the journey in worse conditions. "You're welcome back anytime," Henry said as they shook hands. "Could use the help with that roof before the summer rains come." "I'll return in a few days," Kieran promised, surprised by how much he meant it. Violet walked him to where Penny was tethered. In the dim light of the waning moon, her face was mostly shadow, but he could feel her eyes on him. "Thank you for helping my father," she said quietly. "He's stronger than he looks, but that beam was too much for one man." "Glad I came by when I did," Kieran replied. She hesitated, then asked, "Why did you really come, Mr. Blackwood?" He could have deflected, could have maintained the careful distance he'd built around himself, but something about the night and the warmth of shared company loosened his tongue. "I missed your singing," he admitted, worried something might have happened. Her sharp intake of breath was audible in the stillness. "I've been helping Father clear the field. We're racing against time to get crops planted." "I understand," he said, though the rational explanation didn't erase the relief he felt knowing she was safe. "Will you really come back?" She asked, and there was a vulnerability in her voice that touched something deep inside him. "Yes," he said simply. "I will." As he rode home through the darkness, Kieran realized that for the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. True to his word, Kieran returned 3 days later with tools and supplies from his own stores. Henry welcomed him with genuine warmth, and together they made significant progress on the cabin roof. The work was hard but satisfying, and Kieran found himself opening up more with each visit. He began stopping by regularly, sometimes bringing game he'd hunted or fish from the river. Violet always seemed pleased to see him, her smile growing warmer each time he appeared. She had a talent for coaxing stories from him, little by little drawing out the man he'd been before grief and disillusionment had driven him west. One evening in late May, as they sat outside the now completed cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Violet asked about his life before Montana. "Boston," he said, rolling the word around his mouth like an unfamiliar taste. "Feels like another lifetime now." "What did you do there?" she asked, her hands busy with mending one of her father's shirts. "Worked for my father's bank." He gazed at the distant mountains. "Wore a suit every day, attended the right functions, courted the right kind of young ladies." "Sounds proper," she observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. "It was suffocating," he admitted, "but it was what was expected. I might have stayed that course if he stopped." The words sticking in his throat, Violet set down her sewing. "If what?" Kieran took a deep breath. "If my parents and sister hadn't died. Influenza swept through in 75, took half our neighborhood, including my entire family. Within a month, I was alone." Her hand found his in the gathering darkness, her touch warm and steady. "I'm so sorry, Kieran." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and somehow that, combined with the simple human contact, broke something open inside him. Words he hadn't spoken aloud came pouring out, his guilt at being the only survivor, the hollow feeling of walking through their empty home, the crushing weight of a life he no longer wanted without them in it. "So I sold everything, packed what I could carry, and headed west. Kept going until the land felt big enough to breathe in again." Violet's hand remained in his, neither of them acknowledging the connection even as their fingers intertwined more securely. My mother always said grief is just love with nowhere to go, she said softly. Maybe that's why you needed all this space. The insight struck him like a physical blow, so accurate it nearly took his breath away. Your mother sounds like she was wise. She was. Violet smiled sadly. She also believed that hearts can heal given time and the right care. They sat in companionable silence as the first stars appeared, their hands still joined, a tentative bridge between two wounded souls. When Henry emerged from the cabin, they separated naturally, but something had shifted between them, an understanding that went beyond words. As May turned to June, Kieran found himself spending more time at the Moore homestead than at his own cabin. He helped with the endless tasks of establishing a new farm, clearing more land, planting crops, building a small barn for the milk cow and chickens Henry had purchased from a neighboring homesteader. In return, he experienced the forgotten pleasure of regular meals shared with others, of conversation and laughter, of Violet's singing in the evenings as they sat by the fire. Slowly, the walls he'd built around himself began to crumble. One particularly hot afternoon, as they worked to dig an irrigation ditch from the river to the fields, Henry paused, leaning on his shovel. "Been meaning to ask you something, Kieran," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Kieran straightened, a flicker of apprehension running through him. "Sir." "You've been riding back and forth near daily for weeks now. Can't be easy, especially with summer storms coming." Henry looked him directly in the eye. "Why not bring your things and stay in the barn until harvest? Be easier on you and that good horse of yours." The offer caught Kieran completely off guard. "I wouldn't want to impose." Henry waved away his concern. "Impose? You've put more work into this place than most hired hands would. Besides," he added with a knowing look, "might be nice for Violet to have company closer than a 2-hour ride when I head into town for supplies." Kieran felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the sun. Had his feelings for Violet been so transparent? "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully. "Let me think on it." Henry nodded, seemingly satisfied, and they returned to their digging. That evening, as Kieran prepared to leave, Violet walked with him to where Penny waited. "Father told me what he suggested," she said, her eyes on the distant horizon where storm clouds were gathering. "About you staying here." Kieran busied himself checking Penny's saddle straps. "Your father's a generous man." "Yes," she agreed, "but I'd like to know if you're considering it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the woman who had somehow breached his defenses with nothing more than songs and gentle questions. In the fading light, with wisps of copper hair escaping her practical braid, she was more beautiful than anything he'd seen in all his years in the wilderness. "Would you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. Violet met his gaze steadily. "Yes," she said simply, "I would." The honesty of her answer, unadorned by flirtation or pretense, struck him to his core. This wasn't the practiced courtship of Boston society. This was something real, as authentic as the land around them. "Then I'll stay," he said, the decision suddenly clear, "at least until harvest." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good." As if to emphasize the wisdom of his choice, thunder rumbled in the distance. They both looked up at the darkening sky. "You should go if you're going," she said. "That storm's moving fast." Kieran nodded, reluctantly mounting Penny. "I'll return tomorrow with my things." "Be careful," Violet called as he rode away, her figure growing smaller as he looked back. The storm caught him halfway home, rain lashing down in sheets that turned the trail to mud. Lightning split the sky, causing Penny to shy nervously. By the time he reached his cabin, Kieran was soaked to the skin and chilled despite the summer air. As he built a fire and hung his wet clothes to dry, he looked around the small dwelling he'd built with his own hands. It had been his refuge, his hiding place from a world that had taken everything from him. Now, it felt like exactly what it was, a hermit's shelter, a place to exist rather than live. The next morning, he packed his most essential belongings: clothing, tools, his father's pocket watch, his mother's Bible, and the few books that had kept him company through long winters. The rest he left, securing the cabin door with a heavy padlock. He might return or he might not. For the first time in years, his future felt uncertain in a way that held promise rather than dread. Henry had cleared space in the barn's loft, adding a straw mattress and even a small table with a lamp. It was more comfort than Kieran had allowed himself in years. "Not much, but should be dry enough," Henry said, helping him carry his things up the ladder. "It's more than generous," Kieran replied, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. That night, as he lay listening to the sounds of the farm, the occasional lowing of the cow, the rustle of chickens settling in their coop, the distant hooting of an owl, Kieran felt a strange peace settle over him. Below, through the barn's open door, he could see the warm glow of lamplight from the cabin windows, where Violet and Henry were likely finishing their evening routines. He was close enough to be part of their world now, yet still separate enough to retreat if it became too much. It was, he realized, exactly what he needed: a gradual reintroduction to human connection after so long alone. The summer days fell into a rhythm: up at dawn to tend the animals and check the crops, working alongside Henry through the morning hours, sharing the midday meal with Violet when she returned from gathering wild berries or medicinal herbs, then more work until dusk. Evenings were for sitting on the cabin's small porch, sometimes talking, sometimes listening to Violet sing, sometimes just watching the stars emerge in comfortable silence. Kieran found himself watching Violet when she wasn't looking, the graceful way she moved, the concentration in her expression as she preserved fruits for the coming winter, the gentle way she spoke to the animals. She possessed a quiet strength that reminded him of the mountains themselves, enduring and beautiful. Often, he caught her watching him too, a soft curiosity in her gaze that made his heart beat faster. They circled each other carefully, neither pushing for more than the other was ready to give, but the current between them grew stronger with each passing day. One evening in late July, Henry announced he needed to make a trip to the nearest town for supplies and to check on an order of fencing materials. "Should be back day after tomorrow," he said, packing his saddlebags. "Think you two can manage things here?" "We'll be fine, Father," Violet assured him, though Kieran noticed a slight flush on her cheeks. After Henry rode out the next morning, a new awareness hung in the air between them. They worked side by side as usual, tending the garden and mending a broken chicken coop, but every accidental touch, every shared glance carried additional weight. That afternoon, as the heat of the day peaked, Violet set down her garden tools with a sigh. "I'm going to the river to cool off." "Would you like to come?" Kieran nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in his stomach at the thought of being alone with her away from the farm. They walked in companionable silence through the woods, following the narrow path that led to a quiet bend in the river. It was, Kieran realized with a start, not far from where he'd first heard her singing months ago. Violet seemed to have the same thought. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked, picking her way carefully over the rocky shoreline. "How could I forget?" he replied. "I thought I was hallucinating hearing singing in the wilderness." She laughed, the sound blending perfectly with the river's music. "And I thought you were a dangerous vagabond, spying on innocent women." "Wasn't I?" he teased, a playfulness in his voice that would have surprised his former self. "Perhaps," she conceded with a smile, "but a welcome one as it turned out." She sat on a large, flat rock by the water's edge and removed her boots and stockings. Kieran tried not to stare as she lifted her skirts just enough to dangle her feet in the cool water, a sight both innocent and strangely intimate. "The water feels wonderful," she sighed. "Summer in Montana is different from Illinois, drier, somehow sharper." Kieran sat nearby, removing his own boots but keeping a respectful distance. "The air's thinner up here. Everything feels closer to the sky." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You've changed since that day." He raised an eyebrow. "Have I?" "You smile more," she said simply. "Your eyes aren't so." Haunted, Kieran looked out over the flowing water, considering her words. "I've had reason to." "Will you tell me about them?" she asked. "Your family, I mean, not just how you lost them, but who they were." No one had asked him that in all these years. People had expressed sympathy for his loss, but no one had cared enough to ask about the people themselves, the lives they had lived rather than just the way they had died. So he told her about his father's booming laugh and secret sweet tooth. about his mother's love of poetry and her terrible singing voice that never stopped her from joining in hymns at church, about his younger sister Martha's cleverness and the way she could talk her way out of any trouble. As he spoke, the memories came back not as the sharp, painful fragments they had been for so long, but as warm, complete pictures. He found himself laughing as he recounted family holidays and childhood adventures, the sound strange to his own ears. Violet listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly engaged with his stories. When he finally fell silent, she reached across the space between them and took his hand. "Thank you for sharing them with me," she said softly. "They sound like wonderful people." "They were," he agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "I think they would have liked you." Her fingers tightened around his. "I wish I could have met them." The simple sincerity of her words broke something open in Kieran's chest. Without thinking, he leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing certainty as she responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they finally parted, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've been hoping you would do that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been wanting to for longer than I care to admit," he confessed. They stayed by the river until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, talking and occasionally kissing, each touch a rediscovery of something Kieran had thought lost to him forever: the capacity for tenderness, for hope, for a future that included more than mere survival. As they walked back to the homestead, hand in hand, Kieran felt as though he was returning to a different place than the one they had left, not just a farm where he worked, but something that could, perhaps, become a home. That night, after a simple supper, they sat together on the cabin's porch steps, Violet leaning against his shoulder as they watched fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "What happens after harvest?" she asked quietly, the question that had been hanging between them finally spoken aloud. Kieran took a deep breath. "That depends. On what? On whether you and your father would want me to stay." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "On whether you might consider a future that includes me not just as a farmhand but as more." In the dim light, he could see her eyes widen. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Kieran Blackwood? I'm not doing this properly," he said, suddenly flustered. "I don't have a ring, and I haven't spoken to your father," and she silenced him with a kiss. "I don't need proper," she said when they parted. "I just need you to mean it." "I do," he said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "I love you, Violet Moore. I didn't come west looking for love, but somehow it found me anyway, singing by a river when I least expected it." Tears sparkled in her eyes, catching the last light of day. "And I love you, my hermit cowboy. Who would have thought I'd find my heart's answer in the wilderness?" When Henry returned the following evening, tired from his journey but satisfied with his purchases, he found them waiting together on the porch. One look at their joined hands and hopeful expressions told him everything he needed to know. "About time," he said gruffly, but his eyes were kind. "Been wondering when you'd get around to asking." "You knew?" Kieran asked, surprised. Henry snorted. "Been watching you look at my daughter like she hung the moon for months now. I wasn't born yesterday." Violet laughed, the sound full of joy. "And you approve, father?" "Would I have invited him to stay if I didn't?" Henry replied, shaking his head as if they were both being ridiculous. "You've got my blessing, for whatever that's worth. Now help me unload these supplies before it gets any darker." The rest of the summer passed in a golden haze of hard work and newfound happiness. The crops flourished under their combined care, promising a good first harvest. Kieran and Henry built, in addition to the cabin, a new bedroom for the couple after their wedding, which they planned for October, after the harvest was in. In the evenings, they would often sit together, making plans for the future. Kieran's knowledge of business and Henry's practical skills complemented each other perfectly, and they began discussing expanding beyond simple farming, perhaps adding beehives as Violet had dreamed, or breeding horses, something Kieran had always had an interest in. Violet continued to sing, her voice carrying across the homestead in the cool evenings, but now Kieran sometimes joined her, his deep baritone blending with her clear soprano in harmonies that made Henry pretend to cover his ears while secretly smiling at their happiness. As August turned to September, Kieran rode back to his cabin one last time. He swept away the dust and cobwebs that had accumulated, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and packed the few remaining items he wanted to bring to his new life. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway, looking at the small space that had sheltered him during his darkest days. There was gratitude in the farewell. This place had given him the solitude he'd needed to begin healing, but no regret in leaving it behind. He locked the door and mounted Penny, patting her neck affectionately. "Let's go home, girl," he said, and together they rode toward the future that awaited. The harvest was bountiful beyond their expectations, the hard work of summer rewarded with full storehouses and enough surplus to sell in town. The wedding preparations accelerated as the fields emptied, with Violet sewing her own dress from fabric Henry had purchased in town, a simple but elegant design in soft blue that matched her eyes. Word had spread about the upcoming nuptials, and neighboring homesteaders occasionally rode by with gifts, preserved foods, handmade quilts, even a fine set of iron cookware from the blacksmith 20 miles away who had known Henry back east. Kieran was touched by the community's generosity, having forgotten what it was like to be part of something larger than himself. These hardy pioneers, all carving lives from the wilderness, understood the value of connection, of helping one another through the harsh realities of frontier life. The day before the wedding, a surprise visitor arrived, Pastor Williams from the town church, who had ridden out specifically to perform the ceremony after hearing about it from Henry during his last supply run. "Couldn't have you two getting married without proper blessing," the kindly older man explained, accepting their hospitality for the night. That evening, their small home filled with more people than it had ever held, as several neighboring families arrived to witness the union. Women bustled about, helping prepare food and decorating the cabin with wildflowers and ribbons, while men gathered outside, sharing stories and passing a flask of whiskey. Kieran, overwhelmed by the activity after so many years of solitude, escaped briefly to the barn loft his home for the past months, which he would leave tomorrow for the new room adjoining the cabin. He was adjusting his best shirt, a new one purchased specially for the occasion, when he heard footsteps on the ladder. Henry's gray head appeared, followed by the rest of him, slightly winded from the climb. "Hiding from the commotion?" he asked with understanding. Kieran smiled ruefully. "Just needed a moment to catch my breath. Been a while since I was around so many people." Henry nodded, settling himself on a hay bale. "Wanted to have a word with you, man to man, before tomorrow." Kieran straightened, giving his future father-in-law his full attention. "Of course, sir." Henry waved away the formality. "Think we're past, sir, at this point, son." He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and handed it to Kieran. "This was my Caroline's Violet's mother. Thought you might want it for tomorrow." Inside the pouch was a simple gold band, worn smooth with years of wear. Kieran looked up, deeply moved by the gesture. "Henry, I can't take this. You can and you will," Henry interrupted firmly. "Caroline would have wanted Violet to have it. Besides," he added with a wry smile, "we both know you're marrying into a family without much in the way of worldly goods. Consider it my contribution to your future." Kieran closed his hand around the ring, feeling its weight and history. "Thank you. I'll make sure Violet knows how precious this is." Henry nodded, satisfied. "One more thing," he said, his expression growing serious. "I want you to know I'm grateful for what you've brought back to my daughter. After her mother died, something went out of her, that spark, that joy in her singing. You gave that back to her. She gave me back even more," Kieran replied honestly. "A reason to live, not just survive." The two men sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of celebration filtering up from below. "Well," Henry finally said, standing with a slight groan, "better get back before they send a search party. Don't stay up here too long. Bride needs her rest, but she's looking for a good night from her groom." After Henry descended, Kieran remained for a few minutes, holding the ring and marveling at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a single season. From isolated hermit to beloved husband-to-be, surrounded by community and purpose, it was more than he'd ever dared hope for when he'd fled west with his grief. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the October air carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Kieran, who had spent the night in the barn for the last time, woke early and walked down to the river where it had all begun. The water flowed on, constant and changing all at once, much like life itself. He thought of his family not with the sharp pain that had once accompanied their memory, but with a gentle warmth, a feeling that they would approve of the man he had become and the life he was building. "I wish you could be here," he said softly to the flowing water, imagining it might somehow carry his words to wherever they were. "But I think maybe you are in your own way." A sense of peace settled over him as he made his way back to the homestead, where preparations for the day were already underway. Women were arranging food on tables set up outside, children were running with ribbons and flowers, and men were setting up benches borrowed from neighboring farms for the ceremony. Pastor Williams had chosen a spot beneath the large cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the property, a natural cathedral of golden leaves that caught the morning sunlight. By midday, everything was ready. Kieran stood beneath the tree with the pastor, wearing his new shirt and the cleanest pair of trousers he owned, his normally wild hair tamed and his beard trimmed neatly. His heart hammered in his chest as he watched the cabin door, waiting. When it opened and Violet emerged on her father's arm, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the gathered guests. Her dress, the color of a summer sky, complemented her copper hair, which was adorned with small white wildflowers. But it was her smile, radiant with joy and directed solely at him, that took Kieran's breath away. As she walked toward him, time seemed to slow. He remembered that first moment by the river, the sound of her voice cutting through years of self-imposed isolation, awakening something he had thought long dead. He remembered their first kiss, the way she had looked at him with complete acceptance, seeing past his gruff exterior to the man beneath. When she reached him and Henry placed her hand in his, Kieran felt tears prick at his eyes. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "So are you," she replied softly, her green eyes shining with love. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. They exchanged vows written in their own words, promises of partnership, respect, and enduring love. When Kieran placed Caroline's ring on Violet's finger, he saw Henry discreetly wipe away a tear. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Williams declared, beaming at the couple. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Their first kiss as a married couple was met with cheers and applause, the celebration beginning in earnest as they turned to face their community as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of food, music, dancing, and laughter. Neighbors who had brought instruments played lively tunes, and Violet was persuaded to sing several songs, her voice soaring clear and true over the gathering. Even Kieran was convinced to join her for one duet, their voices blending in perfect harmony. As the sun began to set, the guests gradually departed, leaving the new family to their privacy. Henry, with a knowing wink, announced he was spending the night in the barn, giving the newlyweds the cabin to themselves. Later, as they lay entwined in their new bed, the moonlight filtering through the window, Kieran traced the contours of Violet's face with gentle fingers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming west with your father, taking on the hardships of this life." She caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "How could I regret the path that led me to you? Sometimes I think about how many coincidences had to align," he mused. "If I hadn't lost my family, if you hadn't lost your mother, if we both hadn't chosen this particular stretch of wilderness." "Perhaps it wasn't coincidence," she suggested, resting her head on his chest. "Perhaps we were always meant to find each other." Kieran considered this, the idea that perhaps his journey west had been guided by something more than grief and desperation, that it had been leading him, all along, to this woman, this love, this life. "Either way," he said, pulling her closer, "I'm grateful for whatever forces brought us together." "As am I, husband," she murmured, the words still new and wonderful on her lips. "As am I." The years that followed proved both challenging and rewarding, as frontier life always was. Their farm prospered under their combined care. gradually expanding to include the beehives Violet had dreamed of, and a small but respected horse breeding operation that utilized Kieran's unexpected talent with the animals. Henry, content to see his daughter so happily settled, gradually turned more responsibilities over to the younger couple, though he remained an essential part of their daily lives and decision-making. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Violet announced she was expecting their first child. The news filled Kieran with equal parts joy and terror, the prospect of fatherhood awakening both his deepest desires and his deepest fears. What if I'm not good at it? He confessed to Violet one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. My own father was distant, loving but not demonstrative. I don't know if I know how to be different. Violet covered his hand with her own. You already are different, she assured him. I see how you are with the neighbor's children, with the new colts in spring. You have so much love to give, Kieran. Our child will be blessed to receive it. Her confidence in him bolstered his own, and as her pregnancy progressed, Kieran threw himself into preparations, building a cradle from the finest pine, expanding their cabin to include a nursery, even reading medical texts procured from town to better understand what Violet was experiencing. Their daughter, Caroline Martha Blackwood, named for both their mothers, arrived on a stormy night in November. Despite the midwife from a neighboring farm being present, it was a difficult birth that left both Kieran and Henry pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door for hours. When the first thin cry broke the night's tension, Kieran felt his knees go weak with relief. The midwife emerged, tired but smiling, and ushered him into the room where Violet lay, exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. "Meet your daughter," she whispered as he approached cautiously, afraid his rough hands might somehow harm this miniature miracle. When Violet placed the infant in his arms, Kieran felt his world shift once again. Looking down at the tiny face with its rosebud mouth and wispy copper hair so like her mother's, he experienced a love so fierce and protective it nearly overwhelmed him. "Hello, little Caroline," he murmured, a tear sliding unchecked down his cheek. "Welcome to our world." Life adjusted to accommodate their new addition. Kieran proved to be a natural father, as Violet had predicted, often carrying the baby in a sling across his chest as he went about his daily tasks. His deep voice singing lullabies became a common sound in the evenings, much to Henry's amusement and Violet's delight. As Caroline grew, so did their farm and their connection to the community around them. The lonely hermit Kieran had once been seemed like a character from someone else's story, a man he could barely recognize in himself anymore. 3 years after Caroline's birth, their family expanded again with the arrival of twins, a boy they named Henry Kieran, and a girl they called Elizabeth Rose. The double blessing brought double the joy and double the work, but by then their homestead was prosperous enough to hire occasional help, particularly during harvest season. On the twins' first birthday, as they watched the children playing on a blanket in the yard, Henry turned to Kieran with a thoughtful expression. "Remember that day I found you eavesdropping on my daughter by the river?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Kieran chuckled. "I wasn't eavesdropping, I was appreciating music from a respectful distance. Call it what you will," Henry replied with a snort. "Point is, look what came of it." He gestured to the thriving farm around them, to Violet, who was hanging laundry while singing one of her favorite songs, to the children who were the living embodiment of their love. Not bad for a hermit and a farmer's daughter, eh? Kieran followed his gaze, taking in the life they had built together. "Not bad at all," he agreed, his heart full. That evening, after the children were asleep and Henry had retired to his room, Kieran and Violet sat on the porch steps, much as they had the night before their wedding. The years had added subtle changes to both of them, a few strands of silver in Violet's copper hair, lines of laughter around Kieran's eyes, but the way they looked at each other remained unchanged. 10 years ago today," Kieran said quietly, "I was alone in a cabin miles from here, convinced I'd never know happiness again." Violet leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "And now?" He turned to look at her, the woman whose song had called him back from the wilderness of his grief. Now I know that happiness isn't something you find once and keep forever. It's something you choose every day in the people you love and the life you build together. My wise husband, she murmured, pressing a kiss to his cheek. Perhaps you should be the one singing the songs of wisdom, Kieran laughed. I think I'll leave the singing to you. Some talents are better appreciated than imitated. As if on cue, a nightingale began to sing in the distance, its melody floating through the cool evening air. They sat in companionable silence, listening to nature's music and the gentle sounds of their sleeping household. Sing for me, Kieran asked after a while. The song you were singing that first day, by the river. Violet smiled and began to sing softly, the Irish ballad about love lost, and found again taking on new meaning with the years of their shared life behind them. Her voice, still as clear and pure as the day he'd first heard it, wrapped around him like an embrace. As the last notes faded into the night, Kieran knew with absolute certainty that he had found not just an answer by that river so many years ago, but a question he would gladly spend the rest of his life answering. How much joy, how much love, how much life could they create together? The answer, it seemed, was boundless.